His mood worsened with the bitter taste of the schnapps left in his mouth. He could feel people fuck right above his head, and when he thought that this evening could not get more obnoxious, someone took the seat next to him at the bar. Not just anyone. She, Aurora Vespucci. For a second, he wanted to slap himself for not seeing it earlier. Of course, Bishop's secret royal contact was her. Why had he been so sick? For a second, he wanted to slap himself for not seeing it earlier. Of course, Bishop's secret royal contact was her. Why had he been so thick? Bishop had been assigned to the case 13 years ago and tried to investigate against much resistance from the Vespuccis. To the royal family, the attack was a family affair, and they did not like outsiders intruding in their family affairs. They discouraged members of the Ithacan court to look at the matter and almost banned Bishop from the Ithacan because they did not like their meddling. Bishop had not stopped investigating it though. Apparently, the survivor of the crime herself had not either. He recognized her from his educational days at Kurt. She had hair so dark. He recognized her easily from his educational days at Kurt. She had hair so dark it seemed black in this light, while her skin was white, translucent to a point he could see bluish veins in her neck. Shark white, it was called in the Anchorlands. Her eyes were a starless winter night sky, and had hardness about them that had people looking away without knowing why they looked away. He even recognized her prosthesis. It was mostly light carbon and did nothing to hide the intricate mechanics inside. He'd seen her wear it in court and concluded that it was advanced enough for fine movements, maybe even sensation in the fingertips. It was unquestionably a product of the Forgers Guild of Tatawanu. Nobody this side of the toe was capable of such craftsmanship. Every investigator had to spend a few weeks at an Ithacan court during education. It was the only time, and for many like him the last time, that they were allowed to set foot on Ithacan. She had still practiced law then. He'd never heard people utter insults with such admiration. The cripple, they'd call her. The joke was that crippler would have been more appropriate. She was a prosecutor and preferably took up cases that had little to no chance of seeing a court because they involved people important to the heir's inner circle. If the cases did go to trial, it was an event people flocked to, similarly to the way they flocked to duels. She was a skillful prosecutor that asked harsh questions. And had no mercy on anyone, especially not on high-ranking, respected inner circle members. Other representatives looked down on her for that as much as they feared her. To him, the most frightening thing about her was not that she dared to ask those questions, but rather that she never asked a question that she did not already know the answer to. She ordered schnapps with the barkeep, and they filled her a glass and stepped away far enough to give them some privacy. Seder tried not to stare at her, and failed.
Rough night?
Her tone was weirdly casual, as if they were nothing more than two strangers getting into conversation on a rainy night at the local lovehouse. God stood up, he answered, and a small smile played around her mouth.
Really? What kind of ass would leave you waiting in this weather?
The royal kind, he wanted to say, but didn't. How can I be of service, my liege? He asked instead in as formal a tone as he could manage. It had been a while since he used that title. She froze, then sized him up once with eyes as hard as diamonds.
You left my family's service a while ago, so cut the crap.
He sighed. Not all former soldiers from Ithacan became investigators for the High Court, but all deserters did. It was the only way to stay out of prison.
And apart from that, I needed Bishop's services for this. Why did they send you in their stead?
They trust me.
And are they right to do so?
The question irritated him, or rather, her change of manner from casual to demanding irritated him. Tell me what this is about, and I'll make an educated guess. She considered her drink, stalling time.
It's about a box of files that I cannot retrieve without attracting unwanted attention. Bishop was supposed to get it for me. It needs to be as inconspicuous as possible.
Where is it?
On a territory in Iber, west of Taviranuva.
Taviranuva was a port settlement at the southeast coast of Iber. Anxiety welled up in Seder. He knew a territory in that location, and as its occupants considered themselves tutors and archivists, there were a lot of boxes with files around. A schooling territory? He asked. Mixed? He made quotation marks with his fingers, but she still furrowed her brow at the term.
We're the same species,
she replied, quoting a slogan from conflicts long past, and Seder fell silent. The first rulers of Ithacan decided that the planet needed to be repopulated at all costs and in a controlled process. Wielding was the only way to survive, to grow enough food, to be warm, to build shelter. So wielders needed to make more wielders, people who spent the great silence above ground sought contact. They established support routes between all the small territories, organized food and fresh water distribution, and in general had no further plans for society. All they knew was that people had bodies with desires. They hungered not only for food and water, but also very much for touch and laughter and music, dancing and drugging up and fucking. And they had those desires in peace and in war, in freedom and in prison, in plenty years and in starving years, with or without the dreadful drones in the sky. It was them, the successors of the refugees who returned from the wage, that first gave proof that wielding was not the only way to survive, and that wielders, foragers, cruoids, and lipids, despite their many differences, were one species that could live with and even reproduce with each other. The royal rulers of Ithacan still ignored this fact with some success. Shall I bring the box back here?
No. I'll tell you where I need it as soon as you get it. Or rather, Bishop will.
He raised an eyebrow at her, but let it fall halfway. Whatever it was, she was paranoid about it. He emptied his glass. What's in the box?
None of your concern.
If I retrieve it for you, I'll see anyway, he argued. She sighed and became very still for a moment, then sighed again.
Case files.
Case files? What kind of cases? She rolled eyes at him, then got up very suddenly, but only to bow down to him.
You'll find out soon enough.
She put her left hand on his shoulder. Seder froze automatically and shut down his senses as hard as he could. Touching was something people in the dressed areas of lovehouses did when they wanted sex with someone. But of course, he was not foolish enough to believe that Aurora Vespucci wanted sex with. Or does she? He needed to stop drinking schnapps as of right now. She kept her hand on his shoulder to steady herself as she got out of her high-heeled shoes. Seder's eyes widened. She smirked at his dumbstruck face expression, then turned around and walked over to the curtain, leaving her shoes standing next to his seat. Without the shoes, she was at least a head smaller than him. Seder stared after her, too astonished to do something just yet. Taking off one's shoes in front of somebody specific in a lovehouse meant an invitation, and not an invitation to any kind of sexual activity. In the language of lovehouses, what she did was an invitation to follow her to a private room and have the kind of sex known as the submissive variation. It was a promise to submit to him, an invitation for him to take the reins, to dominate her. The variation was common enough. Usually, though, it was not the kind of game one played with strangers. Only someone experienced would do that, someone who was very sure of themselves. Excitement, or the memory of it, sparked up in him. It had been ages since he'd done that with someone. Years. His last steady lover preferred custom sex, which was fine with him. He knew how to take care of his hungers without bothering a partner that didn't share them. Still, he could not ignore the intense want he felt at the thought of following her. But that doesn't make sense, a voice inside him argued. It's merely a way to get more privacy for conspiratorial talk without raising attention. That's all. Seder sighed and shook his stupid head at himself, then got up and gathered his stuff and her shoes and followed her. She had been waiting for him and smirked some more when he slipped behind the curtain. Was that a pretense or sincere smugness? There was no one around to pretend to. She turned and went upstairs. He walked behind her and tried to keep his eyes down, tried not to think about her body, which was fruitless. He thought about her body dozens of times before in court. She was curvy, and in addition, her clothes were tight and empathic of those curves. That kind of clothing style was not common in Ithacan culture. Seder remembered sitting in court and having a hard time listening to the mediator as they explained the proceedings because she was standing near, reading something in a case file, and he was staring at her ass and wondered what it would feel like to bury his hands in her buns, only to scold himself internally and force his eyes away again. Once in that time he had even thought about her when he touched himself. He remembered it because it was the first time he did it after. Seder pushed the memory down as fast as he could. They reached the top of the stairs and went through a door into a small, empty room that had only one tiny window set into the ceiling. She watched him as he closed the door and put down the stuff he'd been carrying. When he was done, he looked back at her, expecting her to say something. She regarded him for another second before she raised her hand and drew a pickup triangle in the air, which meant penetration allowed. His head swam. She meant it. For a moment he was dumbstruck at this invitation. Then he remembered that he had to respond and found that he already knew what he wanted. His hand made a fist and he touched it to his chest, which informed her that he was a wielder. There was always a chance of an intended wielding during such activities, so new partners needed to be warned accordingly, especially with him. His rare set of talents needed touch, and when he lost control over his perception, it might happen that he read things that he was not supposed to read. They were surface-level things, bodily things, but even that could be an invasion of privacy. She didn't repeat the gesture. Instead, she slipped one hand into the pocket of her skirt and retrieved dried copper flower buds. She chose a bigger one of the dark purple buds and ate it. Copper flower was a contraceptive. It was handed out at the bar downstairs on request. She extended her hand to him.